It is my enormous pleasure to introduce Eileen from the University of Kansas, who's going to talk to us about ordering anything, rejiggering Linnebo's ordinal abstraction.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Rejiggering is not a word that I use very often, but it popped into my head in this, and I could not take it out. It just stayed there. That's the title. Today I'm going to be talking about Øystein Linnebo's account of the natural numbers. He wants to develop an account of the numbers as ordinals instead of cardinals, but he's got an abstractionist view, so this is kind of a deviation from the standard abstractionist picture that goes through Hume's principle. I'm not going to raise any devastating objections. What I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to step inside the view and figure out what the best kind of version of it would look like. And I think the best version of a Linnebo-style view is not the version that he presents in his recent book, Thin Objects, but it involves some kind of minor rejiggerings here and there to make it look like the rest of his account more. The sorts of suggestions that I'm going to raise are things that Linnebo kind of anticipates. He has this one paragraph in the book where he points to a view kind of like the one I'm going to develop. But he says no more about it, and I kind of think that's the view you should have developed, so go that way. So here's the structure of my talk. I'm going to start by talking about Linnebo's account of the natural numbers. Yes, that word up there is not the word ordinals. It's got that Norwegian O with a line through it that I can't pronounce. That is the first letter of Linnebo's first name. I'm going to call them the ordinals. And my reason for doing that is that the sorts of objects that Linnebo describes aren't all ordinals. So I'm going to call them the ordinals. And then after talking about Linnebo's account of the natural numbers and his ordinals, this is not a term that he uses, by the way. I will suggest a first modification to that view. Linnebo sets some restrictions on the sorts of orderings on which one can do an abstraction to get the ordinals, and I want to lift that restriction entirely. But if you do that, it looks like you run into the Burali-Forti paradox, which seems like a bad thing. So in order to avoid the Burali-Forti paradox, I'm going to suggest mirroring Linnebo's view for set theory, and in order to avoid, say, Russell's paradox. In that case, he appeals to predicativity and dynamic abstraction. So I'll talk through those briefly in the context of set theory, and then I'll just show how it applies to the case of the natural numbers. And at the end, I'll talk about a suggestion that Linnebo's made that's involved merely loosening the restriction that I try to get rid of entirely in point 2, and I don't think that's going to work as well. So that's where I will be going. Okay, so the goal of his account is to give an abstractionist account that is an abstractionist account of the natural numbers that is an account that relies on an abstraction principle. And given this audience, I'm assuming that people are already familiar with abstraction principles. Kind of. Okay, so one standard abstraction principle is Hume's principle, which says that the number of f's is equal to the number of g's if and only if the f's and the g's are in one-to-one correspondence. So what you have there is you have a biconditional. On one side, you've got an equivalence relation between two sorts of entities. In the case of Hume's principle, it's two concepts, the f's and the g's. And the equivalence relation is this one-to-one correspondence. And on the other side of the biconditional, you have an identity claim. And so the idea is you're moving from an equivalence relation between concepts in Hume's principle, and you're transforming that into an identity relation between cardinal numbers, right? And people who have abstractionist accounts try to give accounts on which what it is to be an object of a certain sort, the object identified on the identity side of the biconditional, is to, like those sorts sorts of objects just are the objects that have the truth conditions that are given on the other side of the biconditional. So what it is to be a number, right? What it is for one number to be the same as another. Well, numbers are just the objects that have the truth conditions that are given by these one-to-one correspondence claims. So Linnebo's going to have an account sort of that sort, but it's going to be with ordinals instead of cardinals. Ordinals are places in discrete orderings. At least with the natural numbers, there's some further details. And cardinals are sizes of collections. So with ordinals, think first, second, third, fourth. And with cardinals, think singleton, pair, triple, foursome, fivesome, etc. Okay, so Linnebo starts with what he calls concrete numerals and the orderings in which they stand. I'm going to come back to talk about what concrete numerals are. This is going to be the first restriction that I'm going to want to list. I don't want to limit things to concrete numerals. But roughly, we can think of them as just concrete objects for now. And he also set some constraints on the kinds of orderings that are suitable. And some of these are structural constraints. So in particular, he wants suitable orderings to be discrete linear orderings with initial elements. So intuitively, what you've got is an ordering that has a first element, and it progresses forward in discrete steps, and it never loops back. Nothing that appears in multiple places. If we were to do, say, women's basketball national championships, this wouldn't work so well because UConn appears too many times, right? So what we want instead is discrete, different objects in each of the positions. I know nothing about men's basketball titles. I just know UConn is good at women's basketball. So one thing to notice is this is actually a pretty minimal sort of restriction. So you can have a discrete linear ordering with an initial element that is of finite length. You can have one that is of infinite length. You can also, if you think about, say, non-standard levels of arithmetic, you can see elements of some of these that will be ill-founded. That is, some elements will have infinitely many predecessors. And some of them will be well-founded. They'll only have, say, finitely many predecessors. So we start with these numerals, and they appear in orderings with a certain sort of structure. And now we're going to need an equivalence relation on them. And what we're going to have then is a relation between pairs of concrete numerals, we'll call these U and UConn, and their respective suitable ordering relations on R prime. So this equivalence relation is going to be between these pairs. The element, the ordering in which they occur, is going to be, say, related to another element in an ordering in which it occurs. And this intuitively, this holds when the two elements are analogously located in their respective orderings. But that's a pretty loose way of saying it. One thing we're going to want is we're going to want elements to be able to be analogously located in orderings of different lengths. Right? So if you've got, say, a swim race with 6 swimmers and a running race with 8 runners, it seems like the bronze medalists in both of those races occupy the same position in their respective orderings, even though if you look at the whole ordering, they don't because there are different lengths. So instead, we're going to say if there are initial segments in which they're analogously located, that's enough. And so here's a more precise version of saying it. Two objects and their orderings will be analogously located if and only if for some initial segments of each of the orderings, there is an order-preserving correlation between the elements of those segments that match the one element in the first ordering to the other element in the second ordering. So this should hopefully be fairly intuitive. The idea is if you map the first one to the first one, the one after the first one to the one after the first one, and keep going, there will be some correlation that does that, that maps the elements in question to each other. So now we've got an equivalence relation. Two objects are equivalently located if that relation holds. And for Linnebo's abstraction, it's just going to be a matter of applying a particular abstraction principle using that equivalence relation to generate abstract objects. So I'm calling it LAP for Linnebo's abstraction principle, and N here is supposed to be numbered. So the number of a particular element in its ordering is going to be the same as the number of another element in its ordering, if and only if the two are analogously located by this equivalence relation. Okay. And I'm going to call the objects, these numbers, I'm going to call them ordinals. Again, because, well, I mentioned earlier that you can have some elements that are ill-founded, and all of the ordinals have to be well-founded. Right? So they're not all ordinals, so I'll call them ordinals. Okay, so now we've got objects, we've got these ordinals, and another thing you're going to need in order to do basic arithmetic is you're going to need a successor relation. And so the successor relation can be defined in a fairly straightforward way using the resources we've already got. We just have to notice that orderings have natural successor relations within them, and once we use those in the equivalence relation that we've already talked about, we'll be able to get a successor relation. So first, recognize this natural successor relation on whatever ordering we're looking at, and then second, we're going to kind of take an intermediate step between the natural successor relation and the successor on the ordinals themselves. And we're going to say there's a successor relation on positions in orderings. And this successor relation will hold on positions in ordering. But basically, one object in its ordering will be the successor of another object in its ordering, if and only if the first object in its ordering is the natural successor of something that is equivalent to the other object in its ordering. This is kind of the intuitive sort of picture. So if you've got your swimming race and your running race, and you've got, say, the silver medalist in the running race, the bronze medalist in the swimming race will occupy the successor position relative to that silver medalist because, well, the silver medalist in the running race will be analogously located with the silver medalist in the swimming race, who is the natural predecessor, or whose natural successor is the bronze medalist. Right? So just like go over and up one effectively, and then you've got analogous. Then you've got a successor relation on positions. And once you've got that, then you can define a successor relation on ordinals by saying if you've got an object in its ordering and it gives rise to a number, right, its successor will also come from an object in an ordering, right? And its ordinal. It'll be a successor if and only if for those two object ordering pairs that give rise to the relevant ordinals that are one of which is a successor of another, if those are such that when you step back and look at the orderings, the elements, the appropriate one occupies the successor position relative to the other. Hopefully that's sort of clearish. Okay. So now I want to talk about, so that's the general picture of how he gets things. He actually gets a lot out of this. He gets many of the piano axioms out of what we've already seen. But I think there are some undesirable features of this view. The first one is this restriction to concrete numerals. So he wants to perform abstractions on orderings of concrete numerals and the orderings in which they stand. And what he means by this, well, when he talks about numerals, he wants to interpret that really broadly. He wants to include, say, Indo-Arabic numerals on the decimal system. These are just the ones we ordinarily use when we're doing our taxes. Roman numerals, any other standard numeral systems you might have. Spoken number words, spelled out number words, strokes used as counting tallies, and just much, much more. So here's a thing that I find myself doing actually surprisingly often in my office with students. I will be trying to explain something that involves small numbers, and I will grab the objects on my desk, and I will use them. So like my mug will be the first thing, and my pen will be the second thing, and my phone will be the third thing, and a paperclip will be the fourth thing. And for these purposes, those are numerals, right? Just like anything that is used in this way. But presumably, if they're concrete numerals, then they have to be concrete objects. They can't be abstract objects. And so concrete numerals are just going to include tokens of, say, the Indo-Arabic numerals, right? Or spoken number words. So it'll be my utterance of the word for, not the type of the word, English word for, right? So it's about utterances and inscriptions. Those are the things that we're ordering, not the types themselves. And then he says this thing, which makes me think actually he should just call concrete numerals concrete objects. He says, I take the numerals to include any concrete object that stand in a suitable order. Presumably, just any concrete object whatsoever could stand in a suitable ordering. So I kind of think what he means by concrete numerals really should be concrete objects here. But there's a reason that he really cares about using the term numeral, and it has to do with how children learn things. But before I get to that, I just want to point out, this includes orderings of any concreta you choose, but it doesn't include any orderings of abstracta. So you can't include orderings of types of the Arabic numerals, say, or types of number words, or types of letters. I would like to say that D is the fourth letter of the English alphabet. Maybe if this view is right, then it can't be, right? Because it's not the same four as you would get from concrete numerals in their orderings. And I think that's a real problem because, neo-fregeanism apply Hume's principle to any objects whatsoever. And this is something that Frege actually talks about when he talks about numbers in the Grundlagen. He says, you can number anything. You can number numbers. You can number concrete things. So it seems like if we want an account of the natural numbers as ordinals, we want them to be able to be things that can be abstracted from any sort of ordering whatsoever. So I think there are good reasons to want to lift this restriction to concreta. But another thing is that Linnebo himself doesn't restrict plural law 5, which is another abstraction principle that he gives for set theory. He doesn't restrict that to concreta. And it's actually really important that he doesn't, because he needs to build sets of sets. So it's kind of idiosyncratic that he restricts the account of the natural numbers to concreta. Okay, I think there's one other really undesirable feature of this view, and it comes out of a particular kind of problem that he faces. Here's the problem. Maybe there are only finitely many concrete objects in the world. And if so, then you can only get orderings of finitely many concrete objects. But here's the thing that, I guess Nelson aside, we want from our natural numbers. We want each of them to have a successor. Seems like a good feature, maybe. But if we can only get finite orderings, then there will be some last number, right? So it wouldn't be the case that every number has a successor if those are the only things that we can use to generate these ordinals. So that's a problem. And he's aware of this problem, and he has a solution for it. And the solution is say, oh, well, every number has a metaphysically possible successor. And what this means is, well, say you've got some ordering. Say you've got the full finite length of that ordering. Well, in some other possible world, there will be an ordering of concreta that goes one further, right? However long you started with in the first one. And so then you can just do the abstraction on that other ordering in that other possible world to get at least a possible successor for whatever natural number you start with. And so he thinks necessarily this is going to be possible. And he also thinks that numbers exist necessarily if they exist at all. So if there's some metaphysically possible successor to some ordinal, then that's going to entail that it's an actual successor to this ordinal. This is the place where he really relies on metaphysical possibility for really much of anything in his overall account of mathematics. So when he develops that theory, he really doesn't want to appeal to metaphysical possibility because it looks like that might lead to certain sorts of explosion, and he doesn't want those. So if this is the only place where he appeals to metaphysical possibility, then it seems like that's kind of ad hoc. It seems like it's something that it would be best to do without. I also just kind of generally have some qualms about appealing to metaphysical possibility. I kind of think that people's intuitions about metaphysical possibility should not be as strong as they usually claim they are. So I just have like my own personal qualms, but I think in this context it's just entirely ad hoc. So I would rather see an account that doesn't involve such an appeal. Okay, so those are the two downsides that I see to his view, kind of even from the internal perspective. And here's the first thing that I think should be changed. Just lift the restriction to concrete numerals entirely. Allow Linnebo abstraction to be performed on orderings of anything whatsoever, and not just orderings of concrete numerals. Seems like a pretty fair thing to do. I also think that Linnebo should agree with me that he ought to think that abstraction should be performed on these non-concrete orderings because of stuff that he says in his book. So the reason that he focuses on numerals is that he's really concerned about like children learning the natural numbers, and he wants his account of the natural numbers to sort of mirror what happens developmentally. And so because of this, he wants the suitable orderings to be understood, or at least potentially understood intentionally and not extensionally. He says this pretty directly in the book. And in order, like, why he wants them to be understood intentionally is that he wants relevant orderings to be learnable and usable, and to play a role in how children learn arithmetic. So for that, he thinks they need to be computable, and also that they need to be defined not only on actual numerals, but in a way that extends to possible further numerals as well. But if you think about the way children learn, they don't learn this concrete utterance of the word for as coming after this concrete utterance of the word three, right? What they learn is the type. And if I were in front of a room of children and I were to say 1, 2, 3, okay, everybody say what comes next. Like there would be a bunch of different utterances at that time, and they would all be right, I hope. If they're of an appropriate age, maybe, and on board with the activity. So I think the orderings that are learned in algorithmic or procedural ways, in general, are orderings of types and not orderings of concrete tokens. There are, some orderings that we do learn extensionally. So when I was a kid, I can no longer do this, but I used to know the starting lineup of the Seattle Mariners. I had that by heart. Part of the reason that I can't recreate that anymore is that I've forgotten some of the extensional bits. Like I don't have a procedural way to reproduce like who is the first batter in this lineup, right? But when we learn these extensional orderings, typically they're pretty short. Right? 9 isn't super long, and we don't learn them in anything like an algorithmic or procedural way. So I think Linnebo himself, when he's talking about why he wants it to be ordinals, and he talks about this appeal to how children learn, I think he ought to include the types as well as the tokens. But if you do the thing that I've suggested, you're going to run into the Burali-Forti paradox, just as described. In order to run into it, you will need to assume from the metaphysical possibility thing, say that there are infinitely many numbers or ordinals. But what you do is you just take the class of all of the ordinals formed in this method in well-founded orderings, and that'll be the class of all ordinals, as opposed to ordinals. And then you put this subclass of the ordinals in their natural ordering. And then you create a new well ordering that just takes the ordinal in the very first position and puts it all the way at the end. As long as you've got infinitely many, you'll be creating a new position that wasn't there in your previous orderings. And then you perform Linnebo abstraction on that object, that's the last ordinal, in the new ordering, and the result is a new ordinal that wasn't in the initial group. So now we've got a Burali-Forti paradox if we just entirely lift the restriction, as I am hoping to do. So I said very early on that Linnebo kind of anticipates some of the things that I'm going to say. Here's where he does it. Oh, yeah. So here's why he includes the concrete numerals. That's going to prevent any Burali-Forti problems. You can't do this last step if those are not concrete numerals on the view that he sets out in the book.
Yeah, so just so I understand, on his view, can you go past omega?
Yeah.
So even though with the restriction to concrete, you can go past.
Yeah, on his view, in theory, there could be transfinite concrete orderings. Yeah. And he talks for a little bit about this. He doesn't want to restrict it to well-founded orderings because he thinks that that's too kind of epistemically difficult. And when people are starting out learning numbers, they don't have any such restrictions. Those don't come around until much later. So he actually has reasons to want to, in theory, include well-founded ones. And other transfinite ones. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, the question inevitably arises whether it's possible to lift the requirement that the numerals proper be concrete. An affirmative answer can be given using the ideas from chapter 3, where we developed a modal approach to abstraction understood as a dynamic process. So this theory is going to protect his abstraction principle against Burali-Forti and ensure its consistency. So I'm going to take a little side road into this dynamic process and show how it avoids Burali-Forti, but also how it is going to allow him to get rid of the appeal to metaphysical possibility. So here's another abstraction principle. This one we might recognize as not being so good. This is basic law 5. Written as sets instead of extensions. There are a few things to notice about basic law 5. Linnebo has a diagnosis of what goes wrong when Russell's paradox comes up. One of the problems he thinks with basic law 5 is that the collections that get put together into sets, they're identified through concepts. And he thinks, the same concept can pick out different sets depending on what domain it's ranging over. So if you change the domain, the concept doesn't pick out consistently the same things. And he thinks that's one of the problems that leads to Russell's paradox. He also thinks that part of the problem with Russell's paradox in basic law 5 is that basic law 5 is impredicative in a very particular sense. Namely, the quantifier on the right-hand side is going to range over objects to which terms on the left-hand side refer. So this is actually super important that something like this work in say set theory, because can see it in null and its singleton. Here's a thing that we all want to think is true, that empty set is not the same as the singleton of the empty set. Seems kind of important. But if that quantifier on the right-hand side does not range over the empty set, you can't get the difference, right? So the impredicativity actually really matters. And so actually when he develops his view, he describes it as a predicative account. Like he's going to modify basic law 5. But it's only predicative in a kind of constrained sort of way. There will be some uses of it that are actually impredicative in this same sense. So here's what he suggests replacing basic law 5 with. He calls it plural law 5. So he starts with pluralities instead of concepts, where pluralities are defined extensionally. And he says, okay, what is it for two sets to be the same set? It's this. It's for it to be the case that given two pluralities, all of the members of the first plurality are also members of the second, and vice versa. Right? So if you get two pluralities with all and only the same elements, he thinks then you can do abstraction to form sets on those pluralities. One thing, so the first thing to notice is that the collections here are not identified using concepts. It's an extensional thing instead of an intentional thing, pluralities. And the other thing is he wants to use it in a predicative way. He wants to say, at least for certain parts of the process, the quantifier on the right-hand side does not range over any of the objects to which the left-hand side terms refer. And given that he's going to need something analogous to null and its singleton, he's going to have to break them into two bits. So here's how he's going to think about, getting the universe of sets and not just some pluralities of concrete things. He thinks that you should start with a fixed domain of objects that have no sets in them. So start with just your fixed non-set domain. And then he thinks apply Plural law 5 to generate sets from all of the pluralities of objects in the initial domain. And he thinks, okay, once you apply Plural law 5, you're going to end up with two different kinds of objects. First, they're the objects that were already there in the initial domain, and then there are the sets that are generated with this application of Plural law 5, right? And so at this stage, he's treating these as different types of objects. So there's no question of whether or not they can be identical to each other or not. But then in the second step, he's going to put the domains together into a single domain, and Plural law 5 will be used to determine identity conditions to see if any of the new things in our new combined domain are identical with any of our old things in the old domain. The first time we do this, obviously there will be nothing that's identical because you started off with a domain of no sets, but then you iterate, right? So you return to step 1 with your newly expanded domain, and he thinks you keep on doing this, and you build up more and more sets. And there are like limit stages and things like that. So if we get to something like null and its singleton, there are no good symbols for the plurality that includes nothing, or the plurality that includes only the empty set. So I tried, bear with me. But when you're doing step 1 of this abstraction process, of this dynamic process, you are treating these objects over here as just different sorts of things from anything discussed over here. Right. And then when you get to step 2, now you can ask the question of whether or not any of those things that you assumed before to be different could possibly be the same, and then you'll do some identification. So the second step in each stage is going to be an impredicative stage in the sense that you described before. Okay, so that's the general picture of dynamic abstraction, and now I'm going to suggest let's apply this to the case of the ordinals and try to get to build up the ordinals in stages instead of just doing it all at once. And so I'm going to suggest, all right, let's let his abstraction principle, let's let that be predicative, and let's apply it dynamically. Linnebo should agree with this, first because he generally thinks that abstraction principles should be predicative and not impredicative. It's just his overarching view. And second, as he pointed to before, dynamic abstraction with this abstraction principle will evade Burali-Forti, because if the Burali-Forti construction is performed in the class of, say, ordinals that are available at some stage of the dynamic abstraction process, then a new ordinal will be formed right at that stage. But that's okay. We weren't assuming, since we're only going stage by stage, we're never assuming that some stage contains all of the ordinals that can ever be constructed. They're the ones up to this point, right? So we can construct a new one. And so effectively, what we're doing is we're kind of denying a sort of the possibility of forming an ordering of all of the ordinals. It's like we can take an ordinal however high that we like, we can form an ordering of those, but there isn't any ordering of all of them because we're doing it in a staged process. Here's another thing that's nice about it. It's going to let us get rid of that appeal to metaphysical possibility that I didn't point earlier. So here's how we're going to get that every number has a successor. It should be, I think, pretty straightforward at this point. Take some non-number object. You do need to start with some non-number object. Make it an empty set. Make it whatever you like. Let's call it A. Okay. Now apply this lap abstraction principle to the following pair, A, in the really exciting ordering in which it occurs. That's going to give you a number, the number 1. All right. Now let's make a new ordering of the ordinals we've generated plus our old object. So let's apply this principle to the pair of A, our object, in the ordering 1 and then A. I've got the number 2. Now apply it to A in the ordering of 1, 2, A. Now we've got 3, and so on. Right? And so for any n, if you apply this abstraction principle to the pair of the object A and the ordering that takes the thus generated ordinals in their order, and then puts A at the end, you're going to generate a new ordinal. So there we're going to get every number has a successor. You don't need to appeal anywhere to metaphysical possibility. And you can also generate limit ordinals in the same sort of way. He has limit stages in his development of set theory, so we can have limit stages in our development of arithmetic too. Here's one thing you might be concerned about. That pointed out, not all of the ordinals are ordinals. You might think, okay, well that process that I described is going to generate and guarantee successors for the well-founded ordinals, but not the ill-founded ones, potentially. That's actually, there are 2 replies to that. The first one is actually the way that Linnebo himself defines the natural numbers is he appeals to the axiom schema of mathematical induction, and he does that before he makes any attempt to prove that every number has a successor. So once he's carved off the ordinals, say, that satisfy induction, now he's going to try to prove that each of those has a successor, right? So I could do the same thing, but I don't have to, because every ill-founded ordinal is going to have a successor too. It's just that every ill-founded ordinal is going to be its own successor. And every ill-founded, yeah. And so if that's the case, then just every ordinal will have a successor. So the successor action is going to hold for all of the ordinals. So here's how you can see that every ill-founded ordinal in this picture is its own successor. So let IFO just be some ill-founded ordering. It has to do with the way he defines successor. So recall that the successor of one ordinal is another ordinal, if and only if an element in its ordering, the element in its ordering that gives rise to the second one occupies the successor position to the element in its ordering that gives rise to the first one. And now, when we have something like that, if we look at what the successor position amounts to, well, the object in the second ordering is going to occupy the successor position to the object in the first ordering, if and only if the object in the second ordering is the natural successor of some object that occupies an equivalent position to the object in the first ordering. But if we've got an ill-founded ordering, if we take, say, two elements of IFO up there, they're only going to differ by kind of a finite number of positions. And so we can just take an ordering, we can take a correspondence between initial segments of those that just shifts the kind of additional integer chain part over by a few positions. Right? So if we have some arbitrary so just think about some arbitrary transfinite position in the ill-founded ordering, it will be its own successor if and only if a condition that actually holds. Right? Holds. And this condition is if it's the successor in the natural ordering of some other object B that occupies an equivalent position. All right. So now take the immediate predecessor of A in the natural ordering, and here's a slightly different correspondence from the one that maps A to itself. We just shift everything up one, and then we're good to go. So for any transfinite elements of this particular ill-founded ordering, the transfinite elements are all going to be equivalent to one another. If you add additional integer chains, which you could do, it won't be the case that all the transfinite ones are equivalent to each other, but each one in its chain will be equivalent. Right? So all of the elements of some particular chain will. So it's going to turn out that every ill-founded ordinal on his picture actually is its own successor. Yeah, so it seems like then there are two problems that I saw at the outset. There were this restriction to concrete numerals, and there was this kind of ad hoc appeal to metaphysical possibility. So I said, okay, get rid of the first restriction and do the same thing you did for set theory in order, just do that on the natural numbers, and you'll get from that every number has a successor, so you can get rid of the appeal to metaphysical possibility. It seems like the thing that's motivating a lot of this, what's motivating the restriction to concrete numerals, is concerns partly about Burali-Forti. He knows he can avoid it if he does this, but he also knows that he can deal with Burali-Forti in other ways. And I think what's kind of really motivating him is that he wants an ordinal abstraction principle to compete with Hume's principle. And he wants that to be an abstraction principle that people who are less keen on his dynamic picture will be willing to accept. But if you just toss out his abstraction principle without the dynamic abstraction and you allow everything in there, you will run into the Burali-Forti problem. So one thing he suggested to me a few weeks ago was, well, maybe he could lift the restriction to concrete numerals a little bit so that it fits better with the learning. And the thing he suggested is maybe you could lift it to quasi-concrete objects, right? So you could include concrete objects and quasi-concrete ones, but not pure abstract objects. Quasi-concrete objects, this is something that comes from Charles Parsons. And quasi-concrete objects are supposed to lack spatio-temporal location, but they're supposed to have canonical representations in space-time and only there. So for example, the type of the Indo-Arabic numeral 4, there's one canonical representation. I can't say it because that wouldn't be the numeral, say the word, right? But that symbol up there is a canonical representation of it. If I were to take Linnebo's, so Linnebo's book will be a quasi-concrete object. I have a copy of it that is a canonical representation of it, but there are others too. And this actually covers a wide range of the things that we think about. It covers letters, it covers things like that. And so if we extend the abstraction principle to ordering of a quasi-concrete object, he thinks you still won't run into Burali-Forti. Why? Because the ordinals are not quasi-concrete. They don't have canonical representations in space-time. And only there, right? So he's going to think that the things that are built out of abstraction principles are pure abstract objects, he thinks. I think there are some problems with that. I mean, one, just to think about the thing Frege said in the grid login, we want to be able to number numbers, and I think we should be able to order numbers too. We should be able to order the prime numbers under 30. Turns out 5 is the third. Right? But it's also going to exclude the ordering of stages of dynamic abstraction that he uses with Plural Law 5. So I kind of think what this is going to end up giving is a picture where he's really trying to accommodate people who have a different view from his own, but in the process, he's going to do something to undermine his own view, right? He thinks, I want an abstraction principle that people who are not into dynamic abstraction can accept, but if he does that, then it's going to do something to undermine his own dynamic abstraction. The dynamic abstraction doesn't occur in space and time because it's like, I don't know, an instantaneous sort of thing. It's definitely not in space. Right? I think it's not in time. And the other thing is, it still seems to run into the problem potentially with metaphysical possibility. Or at least it's not obvious whether or not it will. You would have to toss in a bunch of really substantive philosophical assumptions to get that there are infinitely many quasi-concrete objects. So say you just look at the numerals, and you want to do abstraction on orders of the numerals. Well, the ones that have actual representations, those are finite. Right? And yes, we have a process for generating more of them, but then there's a question of whether numerals types exist if there are no tokens of them. And things start to get a little bit murky. It seems like if you want to say that they exist even when there are no tokens, it seems like that's going to appeal to metaphysical possibility in kind of a backhanded way. You're going to say, oh, well, there's some possible such inscription or something like that. And so it looks like at least it's not at all obvious